The 28th of April 1945, on the roads around Collecchio, the 26th Panzer Division kept moving before dawn through dust, stalled engines, and the dark shapes of wrecked trucks edging the villages. Headlamps flashed against stone walls. Tracks ground at the shoulders. Ambulances, fuel vehicles, guns, and battered carriers pressed into the same narrow ribbon of road, while men rode half awake beside their weapons. The division did not stop and wait for captivity. It joined the breakout movement and pushed north in armed cohesion, still trusting that hard marching, armored discipline, and one more forced passage through the road net could carry a veteran formation out of the collapse closing over Italy. Its columns were mixed and exhausted, but they were still columns. Orders still moved. Weapons still faced outward. In the dark, the 26th Panzer Division behaved like a force that believed movement itself would save it. That belief was already behind the hour. Coordinated American ground operations had turned the Collecchio Fornovo sector into a closing point before the 26th Panzer Division entered it, and by the 29th of April 1945, at Collecchio Fornovo, the division would surrender with other German forces trapped in the area. The end was not a battlefield legend burned down in one dramatic charge. It was worse for a formation like this. A veteran Panzer Division built to move would be forced to give up organized resistance on a road system it had tried to use as an exit. That is the scale of what was at stake in those last miles. The 26th Panzer Division was not a stray rear guard or a wrecked convoy without identity. It was a named German formation that had survived a long campaign in Italy and still held enough internal discipline to move as a division while the theater was failing around it. Its value lay in that remaining cohesion. Staff work still mattered. Column order still mattered. Guns, vehicles, and panzergrenadiers still had to be brought through together if the formation was to remain a military instrument instead of a mass of fugitives. Everything on those roads showed the strain. Damaged trucks ran beside armored vehicles and horse-drawn loads. Wounded men moved with units that could no longer spare room for them. Fuel scarcity sat inside every decision. A division in retreat could abandon comfort, sleep, and spare equipment. It could not abandon movement. Once movement failed, command failed with it. Northern Italy made that pressure harsher. The roads around Collecchio and Fornovo were not empty military corridors. They ran through villages, bends, embankments, crossings, and constricted approaches where traffic could stack and stall. Every halt thickened the target. Every detour cost fuel. Every delay broke spacing. A veteran formation knew how to endure pressure on the march. What it needed now was room. Instead, room was disappearing. The larger campaign in Italy had already pushed German forces into retreat, and the road net ahead no longer offered the clean arithmetic of distance and speed. The division could still issue orders, still post security, still try to preserve its shape. But preserving shape and preserving freedom had become different things. A column can remain armed and still be entering a dead space. That is why the choice to join the breakout mattered so much. The 26th Panzer Division did not meet the end of the campaign by dissolving where it stood. It acted on the old assumption that endurance, discipline, and continued motion could still force an exit. For a veteran German formation, that was not panic. It was doctrine and practice under final pressure. Its own side still behaved accordingly. Units kept to the road. Escorts watched the verges. Vehicles were coaxed forward because there was no alternative but forward. The division remained something its officers could recognize, and recognition itself was dangerous. A coherent formation invites a coherent attempt to save it. The German side could still believe the corridor existed because the columns were still moving inside it. That was the last comfort. The road net had not stopped them yet. The division moved as if one more passage could restore control. The date waiting ahead was the 29th of April, 1945. The route had already become the place where the formation would end. While that closure tightened, the division's world kept running on orders, engines, and habit. Columns nosed through the Collecchio Fornovo area under the weight of retreat traffic, trying to preserve direction through jammed approaches and roadside villages that turned every movement into a delay. Men slept where they sat. Drivers fought their machines. The wounded stayed with the march, because the march was all that remained. Nothing about the division's behavior suggested surrender as a first answer. It was still in armed movement. Security had to be maintained. Vehicles had to be sorted and pushed onward. Broken transport had to be left or dragged aside. The formation was trying to pass through a landscape that no longer behaved like open rear area. Even before daylight fully settled, the pressure of converging movement was already visible in the column itself. A retreating armored division depends on sequence. Lead elements move, the middle follows, the tail closes, and command tries to keep the whole from tearing apart. Around Collecchio and Fornovo, sequence was becoming burden instead of strength. One disabled vehicle could thicken the road. One pause could bunch traffic behind it. One village street could swallow minutes the division no longer possessed. That was the atmosphere of the final march. Dust hanging low. Exhaust fumes trapped over narrow roads. Men looking sideways at orchards, walls, and upper windows because danger no longer announced itself from a distant front line. The 26th Panzer Division was still acting like a formation that could break contact and continue. It had not yet accepted that every mile north might narrow the column more than it advanced it. The larger war in Italy pressed into every detail. German resistance in the theater was collapsing, but collapse did not feel abstract from the road. It felt like mixed traffic, frayed command reach, and the impossibility of giving every vehicle the protection it needed. It felt like trying to keep guns, transport, and fighting men tied together long enough to pass one more bottleneck. That was the work still being done. And because that work continued, belief continued with it. Not optimism, procedure. A veteran division trusted what veteran divisions trust when fronts fail: movement, order, discipline, and the hope that a route used hard enough will hold a little longer. It was a fatal kind of faith, because it made the division commit itself more completely to the very roads that were closing around it. The more the formation tried to stay intact, the more it had to keep feeding men and vehicles into the same constricted sector. The more it tried to preserve command, the more command had to depend on passage through ground that was slipping out of German control. On the German side, the answer was still to keep the column together and moving. The answer from the road was delay after delay. The division still behaved as if experience could carry it through one more withdrawal, and the withdrawal still looked organized enough to tempt belief. By the next day, the 29th of April 1945, that belief would have to face the place names Collecchio and Fornovo. The veteran name had been earned earlier, and it was about to be tested where movement no longer meant escape. 1942, in Germany, the formation changed its name and its purpose. The 23rd Infantry Division became the 26th Panzer Division, and with that redesignation came a new identity inside the German army. It was no longer meant to hold ground like a line division. It was meant to move, to counterattack, to break contact, and to restore a front that had started to bend. Panzergrenadiers, armored vehicles, artillery, and engineers were gathered under one divisional title. The reputation did not come from ceremony. It came from the kind of formation it was built to be. By the time it fought in Italy, that identity had hardened into doctrine. The campaign there was a long one, and Italy punished units differently than the eastern plains or the open spaces of France. Roads were narrow, valleys forced movement, rivers split the ground into compartments. A veteran panzer division in that theater mattered because it could still do several things at once. It could shift men by road, put artillery into action, screen its own flanks, and use armored strength to buy time for the rest of the line. That was why its name carried weight on the German side. It had remained a mobile formation in a campaign that wore mobility down. Its prestige was institutional before it was personal. Staff officers valued a division that could still march as a division. Corps commanders valued one that could be sent into a crisis and expected to arrive with guns, transport, and panzer grenadiers still tied together. In Italy, that was not a small achievement. Months of combat, broken roads, shortages, and repeated withdrawals had turned cohesion into a military asset all by itself. The 26th Panzer Division kept that asset longer than many formations around it. The method that built its standing was simple in outline and difficult in practice. It did not wait for a front to shatter and then improvise. It moved before the break became a rout. It used armored force as a hinge, not as a decoration. Panzer grenadiers secured villages, road bends, and ridge lines, while artillery covered movement and checked pursuit. Then the formation pulled back in order and did it again. In Italy, where one blocked road could trap an entire column, that discipline kept the division alive. A formation that could disengage under pressure and reappear intact on the next line became feared for exactly that reason. That circle around the division mattered as much as the tanks. Drivers, mechanics, artillery crews, and signalsmen kept the machine alive between battles. The armored title on paper meant little if fuel, towing capacity, and road control were gone. What made the 26th Panzer Division dangerous was that those supporting pieces often held long enough for its combat elements to remain usable. It was not a static fortress command. It was a formation the German side still treated as an instrument of maneuver. And that reputation survived deep into the final phase of the Italy campaign. Even after the wider front had begun to fail, the division was still expected to move under orders instead of dissolving into fragments. That expectation was itself a measure of prestige. German command did not ask a veteran Panzer Division to die where it stood if there was still a chance to shift it, regroup it, or force it through a narrowing corridor. The old belief remained that experience on the march could still rescue a formation from a bad map. On its own side, that was the division's claim. Keep it together. Keep it moving. Keep it armed. A veteran formation could still come through if command reach survived a few more miles. That was the faith inside the name, and it had been built since 1942. The 24th of April 1945, and the withdrawal through northern Italy, the old method still gave the German side reasons to believe. Columns were still on the move, guards were still posted, weapons still faced outward. The 26th Panzer Division was still acting as a coherent military body rather than a scatter of fugitives. In a collapsing theater, that mattered. It meant orders were still being obeyed and routes were still being attempted. To German eyes, movement itself looked like proof. A veteran division that could pull transport, guns, and fighting men through a retreat had not yet been reduced to helplessness. It could still change roads, post local security, and try to keep its march sequence intact. Those were not symbolic acts. They were the practical signs of command. If a division could still do them on the 24th of April, 1945, then the doctrine that had preserved it in earlier withdrawals still seemed sound. That confidence hardened because the larger retreat had not yet stripped the formation of its habits. The 26th Panzer Division still answered pressure with organization. It fed traffic forward. It kept armed elements around the moving column. It treated towns and junctions as points to be passed through, not as places to surrender. In that frame of mind, every mile completed argued for one more mile. The formation did not read continued motion as desperation. It read it as function. The American presence was already pressing on the same ground. But from the German seat inside the column, that pressure could still be mistaken for ordinary pursuit. Roads were threatened. Approaches were less predictable. Local resistance did not stay local. Yet none of that had produced the one result the division feared most. The column was still moving. For a veteran panzer formation, that fact outweighed the warning signs around it. This was the last false comfort of an experienced unit. Its old logic had not yet failed in front of its own eyes. It had not been ordered to dissolve. It had not lost the habit of armed passage. Men still believed that if the lead elements could clear the next constriction, the rest could be drawn through behind them. The old campaign reflex remained alive because it had worked before, and on the 24th of April, 1945, it still had enough visible evidence to command obedience. So the division kept treating the retreat as a military problem with a military answer. Tighten the column, hold the flanks, push the vehicles, preserve the guns. Keep enough shape to matter when the next position was reached. That was not fantasy. It was the surviving doctrine of a formation that had spent years in a punishing theater and had learned that order on the road could still mean survival on the map. A German officer looking at that movement could still say the division remained what it had always been, a mobile formation under pressure but not yet broken, and the men around him could still see the proof in the armed traffic ahead. The road was crowded, the front was failing, and the division was still in motion on the 24th of April. The 27th of April, 1945, in the Collecchio sector, the arithmetic stopped behaving. The division could still move men and vehicles into the road net, but each new movement fed the same constricted space. A route that carried one column now had to carry several. The old German assumption said distance created safety. The new count said the opposite. More traffic meant less freedom. The division was still trying to preserve armed cohesion, while the road system ahead was being contested in sequence. The 28th of April 1945, between Collecchio and Fornovo, German command continued the breakout movement north instead of freezing in place. That was the first practical reaction. The consequence was immediate and countable. One road corridor had to carry the division's continued passage through the sector. What had once been maneuver had become concentration. The formation answered danger by committing itself more fully to the same narrow route. Then the numbers failed more sharply. One corridor remained available to the moving force, but two place names controlled it. Collecchio behind, Fornovo ahead. A veteran division could still post flank guards, sort traffic, and try to force local passage, yet the ground no longer rewarded those habits. The count did not close. One route should have meant one exit. Instead, one route meant one trap because every vehicle, gun, and marching file had to enter the same diminishing space. The 29th of April 1945, at Fornovo di Taro, German forces in the sector made renewed attempts to push through local resistance once the route was challenged. That was the second reaction. The consequence was different and just as concrete. The effort had to focus on a single crossing area instead of preserving wider divisional freedom. A formation built for movement was now spending that movement on one blocked approach. The division was not afraid yet. It was adjusting in the way veteran formations adjust. More guards on the verges. Hasty deployment where the road narrowed. Pressure pushed forward wherever passage still looked possible. But every adjustment accepted the same cruel fact. The more tightly the division organized itself for escape, the more completely it fed itself into terrain that offered fewer and fewer ways out. A German officer could still tell his men to keep the column closed up and moving, because one road was still open enough to tempt belief. That was the last useful order. Two place names held the passage, and one corridor no longer balanced the force trying to pass through it. The 6th of April 1945 had already done its work far from those village streets. When the spring offensive opened, the German front in Italy lost the depth that had once let a mobile division trade space for time. For the 26th Panzer Division, that subtraction came before Collecchio. Stable fallback lines were gone. Rear areas were no longer rear areas. A formation designed to move between positions was left with fewer positions to move between. That loss showed first in the shape of the retreat. As American ground pressure converged to northern Italy, the division could no longer choose a broad dispersal of roads and reassemble later. It had to keep more of itself on fewer roads. That meant less room for artillery, transport, and fighting troops to separate safely. A veteran Panzer Division lived on controlled spacing. Now spacing collapsed into traffic density, and traffic density became exposure. In the days that followed, command reach shortened. Orders still existed, but they had to travel through blocked approaches, stalled vehicles, and mixed columns. A divisional staff can redirect battalions on a map. It cannot do much when the map is narrowed to a queue. The 26th Panzer Division lost the practical ability to move whole subordinate elements intact. It still had officers. It had less obedience at distance, because distance itself had become clogged. That is why the route changes matter. Once the roads around Collecchio and Fornovo began closing in sequence, every detour cost more than fuel. It cost coherence. Lead elements could edge ahead, while tails remained caught behind guns, ambulances, horse-drawn loads, and disabled trucks. A formation built to combine armor, panzergrenadiers, artillery, and engineers was forced to consume that combination just to keep moving. The division lost freedom to concentrate where it chose because the road net chose for it. By late April, the subtraction reached the men who mattered most. Experienced drivers, signalsmen, mechanics, and small unit leaders were being spent in the same constricted movement as the combat troops. They were not interchangeable. A tank crew without fuel could still abandon its machine and fight on foot. A division without the men who kept traffic moving and orders circulating lost another kind of strength, one no late-war German staff in Italy could restore in time. The American side did not need one dramatic stroke to produce that result. Repeated blocking positions, pressure on crossings, and advancing ground forces kept taking away the next piece of usable road. For the German side, the effect was bureaucratic before it was catastrophic. March tables failed. Timings meant nothing. Local commanders had to decide whether to hold vehicles in place, push them into congestion, or leave them. Each choice reduced the division further. That procedural dread can be felt in what the formation stopped being able to do. It could no longer move its wounded separately from its fighting traffic. It could no longer promise that guns assigned to protect one stretch of road would arrive before the column needing them had already shifted. It could no longer assume that a unit pulled off the road for local security would rejoin in good order. The division lost reach, then sequence, then confidence in sequence. The road itself began taking inventory. Vehicles left aside for lack of fuel or mechanical failure did not return. Guns delayed at one choke point were absent at the next. Panzer grenadiers deployed to clear a village edge were no longer riding with the column they had protected. None of this looked like formal destruction on a map. It looked like pieces missing when the division countered itself, and because the division remained in armed movement, it kept feeding more value into the same drain. A static formation might have surrendered its transport and saved its men. A Panzer Division trying to force passage had to commit men, vehicles, and command attention to every new obstruction. The old skill of organized withdrawal became a trap in itself. The better it tried to behave like a division, the more of the division had to enter the narrowing pocket. By the time the final closure neared, the 26th Panzer Division had already lost something worse than ground. It had lost the ability to rebuild competence from one halt to the next. There was no pause left for repair, no spare road for reordering, no untouched reserve of trained movement troops to restore flow. The machine inside the division was wearing out on the road that was supposed to save it. We are being squeezed into a sack, and every hour costs us vehicles we cannot recover. The loss was not abstract. The division that tried to move north had less room, fewer intact columns, and no second road. In the last days of the campaign, the answer to that bad count was not hidden in one road fight. It was in the way American ground coordination kept producing the same result in place after place. The anomaly was simple. The corridor never reopened because the pressure was not a single barrier to be broken once. It was a repeatable arrangement of advancing infantry, armored support, controlled crossings, and roadblocks tied into a larger offensive that kept shifting forward faster than the German side could reset. For the 26th Panzer Division, that meant every familiar countermeasure arrived late against a system already waiting at the next point. A veteran formation could deploy flank guards, throw a local force against a roadblock, or push a spearhead through a village edge. Those methods had value against isolated interference. They lost value against coordinated ground forces that did not depend on one obstacle remaining in place forever. If one block was pressured, another sector closed. If one route was tested, another crossing was already under control. That is why movement became cumulative damage. The German side was not merely being delayed. It was being forced to spend organization faster than it could recover it. A successful local passage no longer restored freedom. It only carried the division into the next controlled space. The old reward for discipline on the road had been regained maneuver room. Now discipline bought only another encounter under worse arithmetic. The division did adjust. It kept trying to preserve armed cohesion. It shifted security outward. It concentrated force where the route looked weakest. It treated each obstruction as a tactical problem to be solved by veteran habits. But those adjustments assumed time existed between crises. American coordination removed that time. A column that had just fought through one constriction met another before staff work, traffic sorting, fuel redistribution, and wounded evacuation could catch up. That failure of time mattered as much as failure of space. German command in Italy had long relied on mobile formations because they could absorb a setback, pull back, and reconstitute enough order to matter again. In late April 1945, the 26th Panzer Division no longer received that interval. The pace of closure denied the division the one thing its doctrine required after contact, a chance to turn battered movement back into controlled movement. The command response therefore became riskier. Instead of dispersing and rebuilding, the German side had to keep pressing north in larger, more vulnerable concentrations because the alternatives were gone. To stop meant encirclement. To split meant losing heavy weapons, transport, and command links. To continue meant feeding the road net with a force too large for the remaining exits. None of those choices restored control. They only chose the form of loss. This is where desperation begins without spectacle. The gamble was not a grand armored stroke. It was the insistence on continued organized movement after the conditions for organized movement had been removed. Every order to keep columns together preserved discipline and increased congestion at the same time. Every attempt to save the division as a division made it easier to contain as a division. The larger offensive setting made that trap durable. Since the 6th of April, American ground operations had been collapsing the depth behind the German front, and by late April, the northern Italy road system was carrying retreating formations under pressure it could no longer absorb. In that setting, a veteran Panzer Division could still fight. It could not restore a disappearing operational margin by local skill alone. What the 26th Panzer Division concluded, in practice, was harsh. It kept choosing the road because no open field solution remained. It kept choosing concentration because fragmentation meant immediate ruin. It kept choosing armed passage because the command structure still existed and knew no other military answer. That was rational from inside the column. It was fatal from above it. By the time the pocket sealed, the German side had exhausted the old belief that one successful push would reopen the map. We have no freedom of movement left. We are only driving from obstacle to obstacle. The conclusion stood in one remaining fact. A formation built for maneuver had been reduced to a single shrinking axis of retreat. Morning on the 29th of April 1945 did not begin with surrender. It began with procedure. The 26th Panzer Division was still trying to move through the Collecchio and Fornovo sector in armed order, still trying to carry its guns, transport, and fighting men north through a road system that had already turned against it. Vehicles were sorted where they could be sorted. Security was posted where security could still be posted. Command still moved down the chain, though more slowly now, and every delay meant another part of the column waiting under strain. What had changed was the scale of obedience the ground would permit. A regiment can obey a road order. A division cannot obey one indefinitely when the exits are closing. Men at the front of the movement could still see a task. Men farther back saw stoppage, dust, livestock carts, abandoned transport, wounded in the backs of other vehicles. The 26th Panzer Division was still present as a name force. It was less and less present as a force that could act all at once. American ground coordination in the sector had already done the work that mattered most. The larger front had collapsed. The remaining roads had narrowed the retreat. Pressure on crossings and linked blocking positions had left the division trying to preserve unity inside a space too small to reward unity. That is why the final approach feels so grim. Nothing spectacular had to happen for the end to become unavoidable. The map had already become narrower than the institution moving across it. As the morning wore on, the crisis turned inward. A veteran armored formation exists by command reach. When staffs can no longer move subordinate elements, no longer promise passage, no longer keep heavy weapons, transport, and infantry in useful relation to one another, rank remains but function drains away. The division subordinates were still armed. They had fewer military options each hour they stayed together on the road. At Collecchio and toward Fornovo Dutero, the German side faced the consequence it had postponed for days. To continue the breakout attempt meant more road fighting with less room, less fuel, less sequence, and no guarantee that any local success would produce an exit. To stop and scatter meant the end of the division in fragments. To surrender meant accepting in daylight what the road net had already imposed, in fact. This was not a sudden emotional collapse. It was a military institution, discovering that none of its remaining choices could preserve it as an institution. Then the break came. On the 29th of April 1945, at Collecchio and Fornovo, the 26th Panzer Division surrendered with other German forces trapped in the area. That sentence is short because the process behind it was already complete. The division did not cease at the instant of a signature or a white flag. It ceased when coordinated American ground operations had reduced its movement to confinement, its concentration to vulnerability, and its remaining command to the management of an end state. For the men inside it, the humiliation was concrete. A Panzer Division had been forced to give up the one military attribute its name implied. It could no longer break contact. It could no longer choose the next road. It could no longer carry its own weight north. Its weapons, vehicles, and marching troops had arrived in the same pocket and could leave it only by laying down organized resistance. The numbers that can be said safely are enough. 1,942. the year this formation took its armored name. The 24th of April, 1945, when the old method still looked alive inside the retreat. The 27th of April, when movement itself began feeding the trap. The 28th of April, when one corridor still tempted belief. The 29th of April, when the division surrendered at Collecchio and Fornovo. The 2nd of May, 1945, when the general surrender in Italy took effect and confirmed that there would be no recovery after the pocket. Those figures measure a collapse of function more than a body count. One veteran Panzer Division entered the last week of the campaign still moving under orders. By the 29th of April, it had ceased to function as an operational force. One corridor had narrowed to none. One crossing area had not delivered escape. Two place names had become the whole field of decision. The interval from apparent movement to surrender was 5 days. For every unit named in that movement, the ending was the same once the surrender landed. The division ended there as a division. The breakout ended there as a breakout. The road discipline that had preserved